All right, hey everybody, it is Doug Beaumont. I am here with my friend and guest, Gary Michuta. He is the author of this new book, The Gospel Truth, How Can We Know What Christ Taught? This is put out by Emmaus Road. Congratulations on the new book, Gary. Good to have you back.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it. And I got an endorsement from some very important people on it, too.
Yes. And then in addition to those important people, you got one from this Doug Beaumont character.
No, Doug, you're on the top of the list.
Oh, hey, I appreciate that. Well, it's good to talk with you. I've been on your show several times. I don't have much of a show myself, but you've been on even this channel already with another book you wrote. So you've really been writing quite a bit lately. That's good to see.
Yeah. Oddly enough, both manuscripts were done at the same time.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, so I had Catholic Answers do the Revolt Against Reality book, and it would have been years before it came up on the queue for printing. So I looked around in Emmaus Road. Actually, I had an interview with Scott Hahn. He said, "Hey, if you got any manuscripts, I'd like to look at them." So,
oh, great. Okay.
Did this one, yeah.
Very nice. Well, I believe Casey Chalk, the last person that I interviewed just before this one, was also with Emmaus Road. So they seem to be reaching out to some good people. So, yeah, so let's talk about this. How can we know what Christ taught? Let's just start with something that should be obvious, probably to most people watching this channel, but why is it important to know what Christ taught?
Yeah, well, first, Doug, I think today there's like a double problem. I think people today, I'm talking rank and file people, don't know Jesus. They may have heard his name, but don't really know why he's important. And so there's kind of a double tax, not only to vindicate the Gospels and their truthfulness, but to also kind of introduce why Jesus should be a focal point for anyone, any thinking person to look at. So that's kind of where this came from. I wanted to do this book in a way to show people that the Gospels are something really to be wondered at. If you think the Gospels are boring and plain and pat, even as a non-believer, that they're just legends or myths or so on, hopefully my book will be able to give you several moments of pause where you just say, that's really strange. Why would this group of legends and stuff do these things?
Yeah, I appreciated how you got kind of right to that in the beginning of the book. Specifically talking about what is a gospel, and that 100 years ago, biblical criticism had a very different view about what the gospels are that has really been pretty much jettisoned today by modern scholars. So what did they think they were, and then what do scholars think the gospels are now?
Yeah, back then it was they put in a genre of folklore and myths, and with folklore and myths, usually you have a kernel of historic truth, but it's filled with embellishments and lots of incrustations of embellished material or myths or whatever to make it into a compelling story. And like you said, that view held sway for a while, but academia has jettisoned that. In fact, now it's, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it's put in the category of contemporary biography or contemporary history, which is, as far as historicity is concerned, that's one of the best categories for ancient literature.
Yeah, I know Michael Lacona's done a lot of work on this, and he's a friend, colleague of mine, and he's actually gotten himself into a bit of trouble with the evangelicals for actually going another step forward and saying, okay, well, if that is what these gospels are, maybe we need to rethink some of the things that we think about them.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah. So, when I first picked this book up, I kind of assumed that it was just going to be kind of your standard, okay, here's how we know the Bible's reliable, it's been done, Josh McDowell, Norm Geisler, William Lane Craig, everybody's got that covered, at least in the evangelical world. But I was really interested to see that you took some very different tacks, especially right at the beginning. Like, you do get into the textual criticism stuff, but it's almost as an afterthought by the time you've gone through all these other very interesting and I think kind of more seldom spoken of lines of evidence that the Gospels are actually reliable. Like you started off with a whole chapter. I think you called it "It's Not Greek to Me." Um, what is the issue there with the original languages that we think the Gospels might have been written in, and the Greek manuscripts that we have received?
That's one of the first, wow, that's weird things about the Gospels. Namely that for the Greek reader, when they're reading the Gospels, they'll notice that time and time again, over and over, the Gospels don't read like Greek. They read more like Hebrew or Aramaic that's put into Greek language. And sometimes it could be very arresting. And so for a long time, I mean, this is not controversial. A long time, it's been recognized that the Gospels use pre-canonical Semitic material, right, as their basis. But my approach is a little different, though, because first I point out, yeah, there's these really strange peculiarities of the Greek Gospels speaking Hebrew or Aramaic. But if you look at some of those, what you find is that some of the underlying Aramaic or Hebrew texts, I believe, show that they're formatted for accurate recall. In other words, these are in a particular form in which people who originally heard it could pass it on with good accuracy. And there's some really surprising ones. For example, my favorite, I don't know what your favorite is, Doug, but my favorite is in the Benedictus in Luke. And there's 3 lines in the Benedictus that it reads, to perform the mercy promised to our fathers, to remember his holy covenant and the oath in which he swore to our father Abraham. Now, nothing special, right? There in English, just 3 lines. And in Greek, it's the same way. It's just 3 lines. But what's interesting in these 3 lines, if you try to back translate into Hebrew, you find that it contains 3 Hebrew words, okay? To show mercy is Hanan, to remember is Zakar, and to swear an oath is Shabbat, okay? Which just so happens to be the same root words for the names John, Zechariah, and Elizabeth. So think about that. That makes it really easy to remember those 3 lines because you just remember the 3 characters in the story, right? John, Zechariah, and Elizabeth, to show mercy, to remember, and to swear an oath, And so there are these really interesting little things that are buried underneath the Greek text that show that, yeah, there is a kind of mnemonic formatting to help recall text.
Now, why would that be important when the Gospels are being written?
Yeah, so it shows that this isn't happenstance. It's not legendary accounts. Or if it is legendary accounts, it's kind of over-engineered, right? Because first, why would you put these memory devices in a text if you're just recounting legend and folklore? And even more than that, why would you include this and then bury it under the Greek, so no one sees it? It doesn't make any sense. So it's like, what, there's more going on in the Gospels than meets the eye, even for a Greek reader.
Now, does this imply that there was a Hebrew Gospel written? We don't have one of those, do we?
No, we don't. I would say probably it'd be safer to say that there certainly is pre-canonical text being used, okay? Whether that was a text that was all put together or they're different sources or something, we just know pre-canonical texts were used. And the import of that, of course, means that the dating for our Greek text, which is relatively extremely close to the events that they record compared to other ancient literature, it's actually even closer to the time of Christ because you have to have these underlying texts to be made and circulate and then end up in the Greek Gospels. So we're even closer to those events.
Right. Yeah, because this was a culture of memorization, right? You actually spent a good amount of time in one of the chapters talking about the fact that the rabbi-disciple relationship was often predicated on memorization and that it was almost synonymous with teaching, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting that this Jesus figure happens to end up in a culture that prided itself on passing large amounts of information, accurately from generation to generation, right? because he taps into that in the Gospels. And even if you don't accept the Gospels as inspired and just reading them as ancient documents, you can see, yeah, he definitely is utilizing these mechanisms.
That was another point that I thought was really important in your book, is to say that, when we go to the Gospels for evidence of their being trustworthy, we're not saying that the Gospels are trustworthy because the Gospels say they're trustworthy.
Right.
Rather, we're looking for the same kind of historical data, evidence, earmarks that we would with any ancient document, and just saying, hey, do the Gospels meet this criteria? Because if they do, then we can't just blow them off as myth or anything like that.
Yeah, I think that's important. And I think it goes a long way where, traditional routes for vindicating the Gospels would take events recorded in the scriptures and then show in extra biblical works how they correspond, so they'll say, see, that they're trustworthy, they're reporting certain things that's happening. But like I take it to another level where I say, if you look at the text itself, not only does Jesus tap into this rabbi-disciple relationship, not only is there evidence of earlier pre-canonical material being used, you have all these layers upon layers of other kinds of formatting, in addition to those, in order to recall things. And I go, and a lot of that's flyover country in apologetics, right? This stuff is not new. Like I go into rhymes and rhythm and the use of Hebrew poetry and stuff like that. Everybody knows that, but I think they miss the import of that because, just like you can recite word for word your favorite song, even though you might have heard it years ago, you can still recall it. It's like, that's a memory aid. That's Jesus deliberately formatted his teaching in such a way to utilize things like that. And I go into all the various layers.
Yeah, and I appreciated the way you did it too. You don't get bogged down. I mean, this sounds like we're like, super, super crazy deep into the text. But, really, you're just giving example after example after example of, look, does it make sense that four different people, would come together and put this much effort into just telling a fable?
Right.
It just doesn't make sense with what we know of humanity. It doesn't make sense with what we know about ancient literature. Like, this just sort of thing doesn't happen. Yeah. So beyond like the writing style and the dating, the pushing the history back to the point where, these things are actually probably being written as contemporary documents, not decades and decades later, as some have posited. You also bring up verification, that there's almost this "I dare you to" claims flavor going through the gospel. So unpack that a little bit for us.
Yeah, and this is where I think evangelical treatments really get thin, because they concentrate on trying to vindicate the text of the New Testament or the Gospels. But if you rely only on vindicating the text, there are certain questions that are difficult to answer, like how do we know whether or not the Gospels are telling the truth, right? How do we know the truthfulness of the Gospels? And to do that, you have to tap into the witness of the first Christians. You have to take seriously the early church. And Doug, as you know, in Protestant theology, there is a red line between appealing to early Christian witness and sacred tradition, right? You don't cross that line. And I think that's a weak point. And it opens up some really legitimate questions by non-believers, because they'll have questions like, well, how do you know that it's truthful? How do you know that what's recorded? Sure, the manuscripts go back close to the time they record. So let's say it did record that. How do we know they didn't embellish it or change it or whatever? Or even if you can establish that the text we have today is identical to the original and they're truthful, how do you know what's the authentic interpretation of those texts? Right, because we could look at the same text and come up with different interpretations.
And I like how you couch it in terms of that many of these claims were backed up, even in the Gospels, with facts that can be checked specifically related to the message. So it wasn't just, Luke mentions the right governor. Well, okay, but so what? I mean, like, right. I could write a fictional book and get the president right. But when you talk about things like Jesus said this, and where he said it was here, and who he said it to was these guys, and
Yeah.
that it's actually verifiable, that you could, you're basically giving them, here's the ammo. If you
Yeah.
want to say that Jesus didn't really do this, didn't really teach this, here's exactly how to disprove it. And who did that? Nobody.
Right. Yeah, I use the analogy, I don't know if I do in the book, but the analogy of cashing a check. Like if you have a check for $5 or $10, they run the check through no problem. You could go through a drive through. But if you're trying to cash a check for like $1 million, right? You can't do that in the drive through. You got to go in, they got to verify the funds. There's going to be a 5 day wait. You got to identify yourself. Why? Because there's a risk if that bounces that they're going to incur huge losses, right? And so if you think about reading the Gospels and look at it in terms of checks that are being written, right? You find out they write a lot of checks and very big dollar amount checks. Like Jesus rose from the dead. He raised other people from the dead. He healed the sick. He claimed to be the God of Israel. These are huge checks and they demand to be verified, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, my dare to verify is in the Gospels. Yeah, there are points where the Gospels actually dare the reader to verify. Like, I'll give my favorite example is John 6, the bread of life discourse, where Jesus says, "You must eat my flesh and drink my blood." And Doug, this is the only discourse where Jesus' own disciples leave him for doctrinal matter, right?
Yeah.
And in reading it, it always struck me like that's strange because remember back in broadcast TV. Okay, you're old enough to remember this as well as I do. Whenever there was a breaking story, we interrupt this program to give you a very important announcement, to give the news, right, and then now back to your regularly scheduled program, right. So it's like, oh, come on, Gilligan's Island. I got to find out how Gilligan gets off.
Are they going to get off this time? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, you're reading John 6, and Jesus is laying down this really heavy teaching about eating his flesh in very graphic terms. Then all of a sudden, it's like there's a news interruption, right? And the narrator jumps in and says something like, Jesus said these things while teaching in the synagogue of Capernaum. Now back to your regularly scheduled program,
Okay, thank you. Can we get back to the story? What happened?
Yeah, exactly. It's like, John, why did you have to interrupt the discourse to tell us a kind of, unimportant factoid, right? Well, I think John sensed that when Jesus is saying these words, his readers are probably thinking, oh, Jesus couldn't have said that, right? So he kind of dares them. He says, look, he did it in the synagogue. Go to the people there, check it out for yourself,
Yeah.
And you find these little dares to verify throughout the Gospels.
I wanted to skip ahead a little bit because I want to save the meaning section for last, because this was one of my favorite
Okay.
sections, and it's somewhere, again, this isn't a huge book. I mean, for those that are maybe panicking about all this stuff we're talking about, this is not a tome. Gary does a great job of impactfully giving lots of examples, listing the principles, but then he just moves on to the next thing. It was a really enjoyable read, Gary, so thank you for that.
Thanks.
You do touch on kind of the more standard apologetic stuff of textual criticism. How do we know that the documents match the originals? And again, a lot of that you can get other places. But what I thought was interesting is that in the same place, you also talk about how do we know that these were even part of the canon? Which, you mentioned earlier, there's kind of a hole in a lot of Protestant apologetics where they'll get you to here, but it's like, yeah, but there's still this giant question.
Yeah, right.
Just sort of walking away from, because you've got this assumption built in that we even know what belongs in the Bible in the first place. So having all of these extremely impressive facts concerning textual criticism, transmission, how good are our copies, and all that good stuff. You also included, how do we know these even belong in the Bible in the first place? So yeah, can you talk on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think it all springs from a thought experiment that I had in the book, where how can you verify? How would somebody who wasn't around when Jesus was around, how could they verify whether the gospel accounts are true? And basically what I do is a little thought experiment where you go to John's church, John's reading from his gospel, and you want to find out from John how he knew that that's what Jesus was talking about. And then we take it one generation later. And what I show is that there's this methodology that you can use that's very intuitive, right? You could explain it to a 9-year-old and they would understand. Of you can when you have multiple attestations all coalescing to the same point, that shows that there is a point of origin, right? That they all share, right? Because Tertullian has a great line. He says something like, um, "Things don't fall into unity, right? They fall into disunity."
Right. Yeah.
So if you see unity amongst multiple points, they obviously must coalesce to an earlier source. And so when you do this kind of investigation, looking at different, talking to different people, going to different churches, what you can do is you see a pattern that points to the original, right? And we use that for essentially for textual criticism. How do we know our manuscripts reflect the original? Well, you look at the manuscripts, you sort it out, and you see that if something is attested as far back as you can trace it, it's found pretty much everywhere, and there's a consensus, then that's a strong indication that's authentic, right? And that's basically St. Vincent of Lorrain's canon, that which is found in antiquity, ubiquity, and consensus, right? And that's what you use for textual criticism. That's what non-Catholics use for textual criticism. But the same methodology can be used in other areas as well. So not only can we identify whether our text has proper integrity with the original, but you can use the same methodology to look at the canon, right? Because you could survey the churches in antiquity to see which books are read as sacred scripture, and what you should find is antiquity, ubiquity, and consensus, right? And that points to the original. And you can use that in multiple different ways. That's why I show in my book.
Perfect segue. I think it's funny because I think to the Catholic mindset, it's pretty obvious where this is going. Whereas I think, and I can still kind of think like a Protestant where I can go, oh, okay, yeah, early church, that's more evidence, that's more evidence. But I think the important thing to note here is that the same method that shows us what the canon even is for the church can also help us understand what it means. Because as you point out in the book, none of this does us any good if all we end up with is a document and we don't know how to understand it. Right. And so that led into my favorite part of the book.
That's cool.
Which was kind of a surprise inclusion in here. I really liked it, where you talked about meaning and you did this really great thought experiment. I mean, I know we don't want to do spoilers and give away the whole thing, and then nobody has to get the book. But I'll put a link in the description below to get Gary's book. But you did this great thought experiment, kind of going historically, like, how would we be sure that we're understanding Jesus when he's here? How do we understand Jesus when he's gone? How does the third generation know that they understand Jesus? So, lay that out a little bit.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's just that's the verification process. And I think it's very commonsensical. I mean, if you were in John's church, he's preaching from John, let's say John 6, the Bread of Life Discourse, since I brought that up. And he says this has to do with Eucharist. Okay. How do you verify that what he says is actually what Jesus meant? Well, what you could do is you could approach John after, say, John, how do you know this? And since he used Jesus used the rabbi-disciple relationship, you'd say, well, we asked him about it. He told us, and things like that, which is helpful. But you could even go further. You can look at the service. How is the service laid out? Would that comport with that particular reading or the hymns that are being sung? Or you can ask around the congregation, right? This is the first century. You can ask people, hey, were you there? Is this what Jesus really meant, right? Or you can take even one step further. You can go to the churches of the other apostles and ask them, John says this text means this, but how did you understand it, right?
I got to interrupt. I have to just enjoy the absurdity for a moment of approaching the author of a text and taking him to task over what he meant when he wrote something.
Right, yeah, especially when it's an inspired author.
Well, maybe John just didn't know what he was saying. Yeah, You're right. Yeah. You still have so many more avenues, even though it would be ridiculous to use any of them, but you do have them. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it's a pretty big footprint, a pretty big historical footprint to begin with that you can tap into for verification. And the cool thing is, and then I say, well, okay, let's go in our Wayback Machine. Okay, a little homage to was it Peabody and Sherman, and go back like a generation later and say, okay, now the apostles are gone. Your pastor's a disciple of an apostle. He reads the same text, and now how can you verify it, right? And then I go through all the different permutations and so on. And ironically, Doug, what happens is the further you go out from the time of Jesus, it's actually a lot easier to identify innovations than when you're close to the time of Jesus.
Yeah, you made a great point of this in the book. Yeah. So how does being farther from the original writer, how could that possibly increase our ability to note innovations?
Yeah, it's kind of like the principle of high definition television, right? The more pixels you got, the clearer picture. And you have a lot more data points you can access as you go further out than maybe you had when you were a lot closer to the time of the events. So again, using St. Vincent of Lawrence canon, if someone comes up with an alternative understanding, let's say Arius, right, in Alexandria, he comes up with an alternative explanation. Well, we look, how far does that go back? Well, it doesn't really precede Arius very much, if at all. It's located, or at least Arianism starts in one particular location in Alexandria, right? Not the whole church, but just this one. And then it spreads out from there. And also there's a consensus, right? Now the consensus, actually, that heresy grows extremely large, as you know. But initially, it starts off quite small. So the consensus was there originally, and then it kind of fades as the heresy grows. But we can spot and say, you know what, Arianism is obviously an innovation, right? Because it fails on those marks. And if this was taught from the very beginning, we should see it as far back as we can trace it. It should be found everywhere, and there should be some sort of consensus.
Tell us in just like a couple words, like what is the overall thrust of this book? Like, who should read this? What interest would spark someone to pick this up?
Well, yeah, I guess apologetic nerds like you and me.
Well, obviously.
Yeah. For those who maybe are discussing things with non-Catholics or deal with non-believers, I think it fill out a lot of things that are missing in other books. I wrote the book for someone who maybe doesn't even know Jesus or doesn't know why he's important. So I really do start at like the very first step, why he's important, and move on. Or just anybody who has doubts, I think that can be very helpful as well.
All right. Well, Gary, thank you for being on. Again, this is Gary Michuta. His book is The Gospel Truth, How We Can Know What Christ Taught. Check the links below. You can pick it up down there. And Gary, always a pleasure. Thanks for coming on the channel, and I'm sure we'll do this again someday with something else.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Doug.
All right. God bless.